If you've ever learned another language, you'll know about conjugation. Conjugation is one of the fancy sounding concepts that language has a lot of, but it isn't really that difficult, especially in German. Unlike in Spanish, you can't drop the subject pronouns and only say the verb, but that's what makes German conjugation so much more simple. The only reason you don't need to say subject pronouns in Spanish is because all the forms of conjugation in Spanish are different. So you don't need the subject pronouns to dictate who you're talking about, because the different form of conjugation with the verb has already dictated that. But in German, some of the verb forms are going to be the same, so you need to say the subject pronoun so you'll know who's being talked about. For example, when you want to say I drink, you'll say ich trinke. You might notice that, well, nothing else has the same form as this. Why can't I just say trinke? And you could argue that it's the same as the Spanish example, right? So why is it incorrect to say that? Well, it's because even though the ich form is unique, look at the other forms. The er, sie, es, and ihr forms are usually the same, and the wir and sie forms are always the same. Just because one is different, some of the others are still the same, so you have to keep it consistent and always use the subject pronouns. It sounds normal in Spanish to leave out the subject pronouns, but if you were to do it in German, you'd sound like a caveman. The verb we looked at before, trinken, is a regular verb. It's like most verbs in German, and they all conjugate the same way. Remove the en ending, add the correct new ending to the stem depending on what form of the verb is being used, and you're done. Not that hard at all if you can remember the endings and the subject pronouns and which goes with which. But not all verbs are regular. Some are irregular. And there aren't just one kind of irregular verb either. There are a few. I know it can never be easy, but if it was easy, then anyone could speak a foreign language. One kind of regular verb is a verb that deviates in some forms, and it's pretty much always the do and er, sie, es forms. So let's look at an example with the verb essen. The ich form follows regular conjugation and removes the en ending and adds the e suffix to the root of the verb, ich esse. But the do form doesn't do the same thing. It changes from ess to iss, and it's the same in the er, sie, es form. So why does it do this? Well, there's really no reason. Grammar doesn't always make sense. It doesn't always do what's logical or what would make the most sense. But that is what makes it interesting, and if it was all the same, it would get boring, and no one would really study it. This is just one of the rules you need to learn and accept, and nothing more, because it's just that way because that's the way it is. So, the next kind of verb also occurs in the do and er, sie, es form, and it's called a stem-changing verb. So as you can tell, it'll be when the stem of the verb changes from normal. Typically, it's adding an umlaut, but that only works if the stem has an A, O, or a U, because those are the only letters that can take umlauts. Sometimes it will also change a letter or change to two letters, like it will typically change to an I or an IE, and this can sometimes be for pronunciation, but other times it's another just because thing, because it looked nice or something like that. And, well, okay, I guess the last kind of regular verb was technically stem changing too, because the verb changed in the stem and it was in the do and er, sie, es forms too, so they're essentially the same, but okay. Well, the first one changed in the whole stem and this one changes just a letter, so it's technically different, but whatever, you get the idea. This kind of verb is actually different, and it's called a separable prefix verb. And what on earth is that? Well, it's a verb that's kind of like a compound word, like we have in English. It's more like a prefix at the beginning instead of another word, and you'll remove this prefix and it'll go to the very end of the sentence, and the remaining verb is what will be conjugated without the little prefix. So, for example, we'll use the verb ausmachen, which means to turn off. If I wanted to say, I turn off the light, I would say, ich mache das Licht aus. The prefix aus is removed, machen is conjugated on its own, and aus is put at the very end of the sentence. So it's not ich ausmache das Licht, because grammar, and that would sound weird, so you have to separate the verb. It just sounds different because that's how the language works, and that's just how it is. I won't go into too much more here because that gets into sentence structure, and that is a lot in German, so we don't have time for that. But now that we're moving away from the actual conjugation, something you might have noticed while looking at about 1,000 conjugation charts is that du, ihr, and sie all mean you. So what does that mean? How do I know what you I'm supposed to use if there's 3? Well, this is where Spanish and French and Italian and a couple other languages actually are similar to German, and that's with formality. You use different words with different people who are different things to you. You won't talk the same way to your friends as you would your boss or teacher or whatever is what I'm saying. So that's where formality comes in. In English, we do it a little more loosely, like there are certain words that would be too crude to say to your boss or teacher, but it's not quite as cut and dry as it is in German and these other languages. And in German, it's considered disrespectful to use the informal forms with someone who's a superior to you, and a little weird to be so formal with someone who's your peer or your family. I'm sure you can think of examples in English, but it's not quite the same. So, du is the informal you. You'll use this with friends, family, your peers like classmates, and people who are younger than you. Sie is the formal you, and it always has to be capitalized, and you'll use that with your teachers or bosses, but you'll also use that with strangers and anyone who's older than you. Now, of course, this isn't too strict nowadays, and it's not quite like Japanese, where respect holds a lot of weight, and you need to be sure you're being correctly formal with whoever you're talking about, but it is still part of the language, so it's something that needs to be respected. And the last you, ihr, is, you probably guessed it, plural you. It's essentially like you all or y'all, but none of those are technically grammatically correct, and it's used when talking to a group of people. However, unlike Spanish, there's no formal plural you and informal plural you. Ihr is used with anyone as long as you're talking to a group of people. So, with all the mentions of Spanish, you might think that German and Spanish are actually pretty similar, but that couldn't be farther from true. German grammar is actually a lot different than Spanish grammar, and it's really important that you don't try to learn German like you've learned Spanish, if you have learned Spanish. German and Spanish aren't even in the same language family. German is a Germanic language, whereas Spanish is a Romance language. And I won't go too much into that now because it depends on what the language used to be before it split up into dialects in different areas, and then all the dialects became so distinct from the original language that they were considered their own languages, like how Latin split up into present-day France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Romania, and they all became French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, and those are all the Romance languages, and they're no longer considered dialects of Latin. But to bring it back to German, German is one of the easiest languages to conjugate in, so as long as you can remember the subject pronouns, the endings that go with them shouldn't be too hard to keep straight. Just know that conjugation is something you'll use every day when you speak. You do it unconsciously when you speak all the time. It's very important, and if you don't understand it, you're gonna have a really hard time learning a language. Especially if you take German in school, and that's why you're watching this. If you don't conjugate, you're just gonna keep failing your tests. It's not hard, just remember the ending. And that's another German grammar video done. I feel like this one took a little longer to get done, but I've had a lot of stuff to keep up with, so that's probably why. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope you liked it. If you want to see more, you can tell me in the comments or whatever. I mean, I have my own ideas, obviously, but if there's something that you really want to know about, I could definitely look into doing it. Also, if you didn't know, I don't know how many people don't know this, but before I make these videos, I make little comics about the same thing on my Tapastic, and I'll link that down below. But yeah, it's always there, so if you want to know what the next video is going to be about, or you learn better that way or something, you can go check that out. And I do have another comic there, if you're interested in something more story-oriented. So I'll link that down below too, but yeah, there's one about German if that's what you want to know about. So, thanks for watching, and see you later, I guess.